The night my marriage ended, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I just slid a single printed page across the kitchen table, a calendar. 8 months of my husband's own appointments, printed out, with every single night he had told me he was working late highlighted in yellow. And beside each yellow night, in my own neat handwriting, exactly where he had actually been. And exactly who he had been there with. Neil stared at that page for a very long time. Because there is no argument a man can make against his own calendar. For 8 months, he had texted me the same 3 words, working late again, and the most boring, forgettable app on my phone had been quietly keeping the real story the entire time, night by night, in his own hand. This is the story of how I ended up holding 8 months of my husband's secret schedule. And I'm going to tell it to you backwards from that page on the table, all the way back to the ordinary morning when I first noticed one small thing on a calendar that should not have been there. Because the tool that exposed my husband's entire affair was not a private investigator, or a hidden camera, or a hacked phone. It was the shared calendar we'd set up years ago to coordinate dentist appointments and dinner plans. He forgot it was still syncing. I did not. But before I take you back, I want to ask you something, and I genuinely want your answer in the comments. How many shared apps, accounts, and calendars do you and your partner have quietly running in the background of your life, things you set up years ago and stopped thinking about? Because most people have no idea how much of the truth is sitting in plain sight, in the boring digital corners they've forgotten about. Have you ever found something somewhere you weren't even looking? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And before I take you back into the story, I want to say one thing to anyone watching who has that quiet feeling right now, the one I had for months. The one that doesn't quite add up. You don't have to act on it today. And you don't have to ignore it either. You just have to stay awake to it. Don't argue yourself out of what you're noticing. And don't blow it up before you understand it. Just keep your eyes open and let the truth do what the truth always does, which is leak out into the places no one thought to guard. You are not crazy for noticing. You are not paranoid for paying attention. You are simply awake. And being awake is the first and most important advantage there is. So let me take you back to the page on the table, and then further back to how it began. For 8 months, my husband Neil had been working late. Not every night, that would have been too obvious, but often. 2, sometimes 3 evenings a week, he'd text around 5 or 6, working late again, don't wait up, big project, sorry, and I believed him, completely, for a long time. Because why wouldn't I? Neil had a demanding job. Late nights were part of it. I'd make dinner for one and put a plate in the fridge for him and go to bed, and he'd come home at 10 or 11 smelling faintly of the office. Or so I told myself. And that was simply our life for a while. Here's the thing I want you to understand about how slow this kind of realization actually is. There was no single dramatic moment. There was just a very gradual accumulation of a feeling, the sense that the late nights didn't quite add up. That the big project had been big for an awfully long time. That a man who used to be exhausted by overtime now seemed strangely energized by it. But a feeling is not proof, and I am not a woman who blows up her marriage over a feeling. So I sat with it, and I noticed, and I waited for either the feeling to go away or the truth to show itself. I want to defend that patience for a moment. Because I know some people hear she had a feeling for months and didn't act and think it sounds weak, or naive, or like denial. It wasn't any of those things. It was wisdom, though I didn't have the word for it at the time. Here is what I'd learned. Somewhere deep down, if you confront a careful person on a feeling alone, you don't get the truth, you get a performance. You get hurt indignation. And a reasonable-sounding explanation, and a subtle suggestion that maybe you're the one with the problem, that maybe you've become insecure or paranoid or controlling. And then you've shown your whole hand. The other person knows exactly what you suspect, and they simply get more careful. A feeling, acted on too soon, doesn't reveal the truth. It buries it deeper. So I held my feeling quietly, like a coal I was keeping warm, and I waited for it to find its proof. I just had no idea then that the proof was already sitting on my own phone. And then, one ordinary morning, the truth showed itself on a calendar. We had set up a shared digital calendar years earlier, back when we were the kind of couple who coordinated everything. Doctor's appointments, his and mine, dinner reservations, school pickups, when the car was due for service. It had long since faded into the background of our lives. One of those things you set up once and never think about again. But it was still running. It was still syncing. And Neil, somewhere in the last few years, had started using his calendar app for everything, including, it turned out, the things he absolutely did not want me to see, having completely forgotten that one of his calendars still quietly fed into the shared one we both could open. This is the part that I think is so important for everyone to understand, because it is so ordinary and so easy to forget. We live our lives now across a dozen interconnected accounts and apps and devices, most of which we set up years ago in a spirit of togetherness and then never thought about again. The shared calendar, the family photo cloud, the streaming account with everyone's profiles, the location sharing we turned on for a road trip, the password saved on the old tablet. Every one of these is a small open window between two lives, set up in trust during the good times, quietly forgotten. And a person living a double life has to remember to close every single one of those windows, perfectly, forever. Neil remembered to be careful about his phone. He remembered to delete his texts. He remembered the obvious things. What he forgot was the boring thing, the background thing, the calendar so dull that even I had stopped looking at it. And the boring, forgotten window is exactly the one that's always still open. So on that ordinary, unremarkable morning, scrolling only to check when my own dentist appointment was, I saw an entry sitting there on a Tuesday evening, a Tuesday he had sworn he worked late. And it was not a work meeting. It was a dinner reservation. For two, at a restaurant clear on the other side of town. At 8 o'clock at night. If your stomach just dropped imagining seeing that a dinner for two on a night he swore he was at the office, do me one quick favor before I tell you what I did next. Tap like and subscribe to the channel. I'm not asking for nothing. These calm revenge stories get buried by the algorithm unless people actually engage, and your one tap is the only reason the next one reaches a woman who is, tonight, about to scroll past something she wasn't looking for. And believe me, what 8 months of a forgotten calendar revealed is the part you came for. Now here is the single most important decision I made in this entire story. And I made it standing in my kitchen the morning I saw that dinner reservation. I did not call Neil. I did not screenshot it and send it to him with a furious message. Because in that instant, I understood something with perfect clarity. If Neil found out that his hidden calendar was syncing to me, he would fix it in about 30 seconds. He'd turn off the sync, separate his calendars, close the window I'd just discovered, and I would never see another thing. Right now, he had no idea I could see his real schedule. And that ignorance was the most valuable thing I owned. So I did not slam that window shut by reacting. I left it wide open and I started, very quietly, to read. I cannot stress enough how counterintuitive this felt and how important it was. Every instinct in my body, standing in that kitchen, was screaming to act, to call him, to drive to that restaurant, to do something with the enormous, sickening energy of the discovery. The discovery wants to be expressed. It feels almost unbearable to hold. But I understood, in a cold, clear flash, that the value of what I'd found was entirely dependent on Neil not knowing I'd found it. The window was only useful while it stayed open, And the only way to keep it open was to act on the outside as though nothing at all had changed. So I made the hardest choice there is. I chose the long victory over the immediate relief. I put my phone down. I finished making my coffee. I texted him something normal and warm, and I carried the entire weight of what I now knew quietly out of that kitchen and into a plan. Because I had decided that I would rather win than vent, and you very rarely get to do both. And what I read over the following weeks was 8 months of a double life, written in his own hand, in the dry, undeniable language of a calendar. Because here is what I came to understand. A person lies in conversation, but they tell the truth to their calendar. You don't put a fake entry in your own schedule. Your calendar is the tool you use to actually run your real life, including the secret parts of it. And Neil's calendar, which he had forgotten I could see, was a meticulous, honest record of everything the working late texts were covering up. The dinners for two. The recurring weekly entry, same time, same evening, every week, marked with a single initial. The client meetings at hotels. The weekend he told me was a work conference, which his own calendar revealed was something else entirely. 8 months of a parallel life, scheduled with the same care he used to schedule his dentist appointments, all of it sitting quietly in an app he'd forgotten, was open to me. The more I read, the more this struck me as almost philosophically true, and I've thought about it a great deal since. When Neil spoke to me, he was managing me choosing his words, shaping a story, performing a version of his life designed to keep me calm and unsuspecting. That's what conversation is for a person who's hiding something, a tool for managing another person's perception. But a calendar is not a tool for managing someone else. A calendar is a tool for managing yourself. You don't write fake entries in your own schedule, because then you'd show up to the wrong places at the wrong times and your secret life would fall apart. The calendar has to be true, or it's useless to him. And so, in the cruel irony at the heart of this whole story, the same need for organization that let Neil run a smooth double life was the exact thing that documented it in perfect, honest detail. He couldn't lie to his calendar without breaking the very system that made the lying possible. His competence was his confession. The initial in the recurring entry was a single letter, D. Her name, I would come to learn soon enough, was Danielle. And every week, at the same time, on a night he told me he was working late, my husband had a standing appointment with her. Entered into the calendar in his own hand as routine and as documented as a staff meeting. There was something uniquely chilling about seeing it laid out as routine, and I want to name that feeling, because I think it's part of what makes this kind of betrayal so disorienting. A single passionate mistake, a one-time lapse, is at least chaotic. It has the texture of someone losing control. But a standing weekly appointment, entered into the calendar at the same time every week for months, has the texture of a life. It wasn't a man swept away by an impulse. It was a man who had calmly, methodically built a second relationship into the regular architecture of his week, slotted neatly between his work obligations and his dentist appointments. As ordinary to him as anything else he scheduled. That was the part that took my breath away. Not that he'd betrayed me, but that he'd organized the betrayal that somewhere in his phone my marriage and his affair sat in the same calendar. Color-coded, recurring, equally routine. He hadn't fallen into anything. He'd scheduled it. So now I have to tell you what I did with 8 months of the truth. Because finding it was only the beginning. Anyone can find a betrayal. What you do next is what determines whether you end up shattered or standing. I did not confront him. Not yet. Instead, I did the quietest, most powerful thing available to me. I documented. Carefully, calmly, over the following weeks I built a record. Not just screenshots that could be dismissed, but a clear, organized timeline every night he'd claimed to be working late. Cross-referenced against what his own calendar said he was actually doing. The dinners. The standing weekly appointment with D. The hotel entries. The conference. I built, essentially, a second calendar of my own. 8 months of his lies in one column, and 8 months of his own documented truth in the other, side by side, undeniable. Building that document was, I'll be honest, one of the strangest experiences of my life. There was grief in it. Every entry I logged was another small confirmation, another evening of my marriage revealed to have been a fiction. But there was also something steadying about the work itself. Something almost clinical that held me together when I might otherwise have fallen apart. Instead of drowning in the emotion of it, I had a task, read, cross-reference, date, organize, and the task gave the pain somewhere to go. I have since recommended this to other women in the fog of discovery, not as a cold strategy, but as a survival tool. When you find something this big, give yourself a job. Document calmly. It will protect you legally, yes, but it will also protect you emotionally. Because it converts the helpless feeling of being lied to into the grounded feeling of building something true. By the time my 2 columns were finished, I wasn't a woman falling apart over a betrayal. I was a woman holding an airtight record of 1, and those are very different women to be. And then I went to a lawyer, and I brought my 2 columns with me. I sat across from her with my 2 neat columns, and I felt almost shy handing them over. The way you feel handing a teacher your homework. But she read them slowly, and her expression shifted from professional attention to something close to respect, and when she finally looked up, she said 3 things I have never forgotten. The first, most people come to me with suspicion and a few screenshots. You've brought me a documented, dated 8-month pattern recorded by his own hand. This isn't a he said, she said. This is a timeline. Do you understand how rare and how strong that is? The second, she explained that the calmness of what I'd done not confronting, not tipping him off, just quietly documenting over time had given me an enormously strong position for a clean divorce. Because I had clarity and a complete record, while he still believed his secret was perfectly safe. Nothing had been deleted. Nothing had been hidden in response to a confrontation, because there had been no confrontation. The whole 8 months sat preserved, perfectly, exactly as he had written it himself. And the third thing she said, quietly, she said, "When you're ready, you don't need to argue with him. You don't need to accuse him. You just need to put his own calendar in front of him. There is nothing a person can say against a record they created themselves." So I prepared everything. With my documentation complete and the legal groundwork quietly laid, I got my own affairs in order, my finances, my plans, my exit, all while Neil continued, blissfully, to work late. With no idea that every late night was being entered into evidence by his own scheduling app. There was one evening, near the end, when he almost caught it. He mentioned, offhand, that he'd been meaning to clean up his calendars. They were getting cluttered. My heart stopped, because if he cleaned up his calendars, he might notice the sink, and the window would close. So I said, lightly, "Oh, don't bother, I never even look at that old shared thing anymore." And he chuckled, and agreed it wasn't worth the hassle, and left it exactly as it was. I had just used his own laziness to keep the most important window in my life propped open. He kept his secret calendar running because his wife told him it wasn't worth the trouble to close it. I think about that exchange often because it's a small masterpiece of how this whole thing worked. I didn't lie to him, not exactly. I just gave his own laziness permission to win, and pointed it gently in the direction that served me. He wanted an excuse not to do a boring chore, and I handed him one. That's the quiet art of staying one step ahead of someone who doesn't know they're in a race. You don't fight their instincts. You use them. Neil's instinct was to avoid hassle, so I made closing the window feel like a hassle. His instinct was to believe I was unsuspecting, so I confirmed it with a single offhand sentence. Every careless assumption he made about me, I gently reinforced, because each one kept the window open another day. The most powerful thing about being underestimated is that the person underestimating you will help you do it, if you let them. And that brings us back to the page on the table the night this story opened on. Once everything was ready, I printed it all out. 8 months. Every working late night in yellow. Every real appointment beside it. And after dinner, when Neil mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that he might have to work late again that week, I slid the page across the table and asked him to take a look at his schedule. I watched him understand, line by line, what he was looking at. His own calendar, his own entries, in his own hand. The dinners, the hotels, the standing weekly appointment with Dee, the conference. 8 months of a story he'd told me out loud. Sitting right next to 8 months of the true story he'd quietly told his calendar. And I watched him reach for an explanation and find that there wasn't one. Because you cannot lie your way out of a record you created yourself. What struck me, watching his face, was the specific quality of his silence. I had braced for the usual repertoire, the denial. The "it's not what it looks like," the counterattack, the tears. And he reached for all of them. I could see it, his mouth opening and closing as he hunted for the angle that would work. But every angle a person uses in these moments depends on ambiguity, on the gap between what you can prove and what you suspect, the gap where a skilled liar lives and breathes. And the calendar had closed that gap completely. There was no ambiguity left for him to work with. He couldn't say I'd misread a text, because these weren't texts, they were his own appointments. He couldn't say I was being paranoid, because paranoia invents things and this was simply printed out in front of him. He couldn't even say it was a one-time mistake, because the page documented 8 months. The record had quietly removed every single exit, and all that was left was the truth, sitting on the table, with nowhere for either of us to look but directly at it. I didn't yell. I said the only sentence I had prepared. I said, "Neil, you told me you were working late for 8 months. But the whole time, you kept telling your calendar the truth. You really should have remembered we still share it." The divorce was clean, because the truth was complete. There was no dramatic fight, because there was nothing to fight about. The record had already said everything, in his own hand, dated and undeniable. The documented affair did him no favors. I walked away with a fair settlement, my dignity fully intact, and the strange, quiet satisfaction of a woman who never had to prove anything, because the other person had spent 8 months proving it for her, one calendar entry at a time. My lawyer told me, near the end, that in all her years she'd rarely seen a case resolve so cleanly, and she asked me how I'd managed to stay so calm through the discovery. And I told her the truth. I wasn't calm because I didn't feel it. I felt all of it, every night, for weeks. I was calm because I'd decided very early that I would not let the size of my pain dictate the size of my mistake. The pain was enormous. My response was small, quiet, and precise. And it turns out that's the combination that wins. Danielle, I heard, did not remain a standing weekly appointment for very long once she was no longer a secret. Because a great deal of what made the arrangement appealing to Neil, I suspect, was that it was hidden. I want to tell you, briefly, about the months after, because the calendar story is the dramatic part, but it isn't the most important part. The most important part is that I got my evenings back. For 8 months, I had eaten dinner alone, putting a plate in the fridge for a man who was off being someone else's standing appointment. And after it was all over, I sat at that same table, alone again. Except this time, it wasn't lonely, it was peaceful. There is a profound difference between being alone and being alone while someone lies to you about why. I filled that old shared calendar, eventually, with my own things, dinners with friends, a class I'd always wanted to take, a standing weekly appointment with my sister that I scheduled in his old slot, almost on purpose. The calendar that had once held the architecture of his betrayal slowly filled up with the architecture of my actual life. That, more than any settlement, was the real ending. And if you'll let me leave you with one thing, not just as someone who got revenge, but as a woman who found the entire truth in the most boring app on her phone, it's this. The truth is almost never as hidden as the person lying to you believes it is. It leaks. It leaks into the boring corners, the forgotten accounts, the background apps, the small, honest records people keep for themselves without thinking. You do not need to snoop or hack or break a single rule. You only need to pay attention to what is already quietly in plain sight, and you need the patience not to slam the window shut by reacting before you've seen the whole room. The people who truly love you are not living a second life in a calendar you can both see. The ones who are have written the truth down themselves. All you have to do is be calm enough to read it. And I want to add the harder half of that lesson. The half that's really about you and not about them. The patience it took not to react that was the whole game, and it is the thing almost no one manages. Because pain is loud and it wants out. When you discover something like this, every cell in your body will demand immediate expression. The confrontation, the scream, the satisfying explosion of finally saying it. And I am telling you, from the other side, that the explosion feels like power, but is actually surrender. It hands the other person warning, time, and the chance to control the story. The truly powerful move, the one that almost no one has the discipline to make, is to feel all of that and still choose the quiet, patient, documented path to want your own freedom more than you want the momentary relief of being heard. I chose the long game. It cost me weeks of holding an unbearable secret across a dinner table. And it bought me a clean exit, a strong settlement, and the kind of closure that only comes from never having had to argue at all. There's one more thing, though, after the divorce. While finally cleaning up that old shared calendar, I scrolled back further than 8 months further than I'd ever looked, and I found entries that revealed the standing weekly appointment with D had not started 8 months ago at all. It had started much, much earlier. And it pointed to a truth about my marriage that went back years before I ever suspected a thing. What I found, and what I did once I understood how long it had really been going on, is a story entirely its own. And it might just be the most satisfying one yet. It's right there on your screen. You are going to want to see how that one ends.